Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the webinar, Black Lives Matter and its implications for our Australian context. This is a platform on which we regularly engage in challenging conversations related to faith and justice. Today, we focus on the Uluru Statement, and Katalina will say more on that soon. As women of faith, Rev Dr Katalina and I wanted to create a safe and welcoming space to deepen understandings about why Black Lives Matter for the Australian context and why such issues matter to all people of faith, particularly within the Uniting Church in Australia. This webinar is held on the last Sunday of every month for all who wish to explore the multifaceted and ongoing impact of social and structural injustices on Black lives in these lands now called Australia. We try to paint a picture on what standing in solidarity with our First Nation peoples looks like from their perspective. And we thank all our Indigenous colleagues and friends who have contributed their time and energy to this webinar.
Thank you, Lofa. Welcome everyone who's joined in. We're very, very pleased to welcome the University of Divinity School of Indigenous Studies as co-sponsor of today's webinar. And as you've heard from Lofa, we're focusing on the Uluru Statement from the Heart. We're particularly thrilled, of course, that our friend and colleague, Rev Dr Garry Deverell, who is a regular on our webinar and well known to our audience, that he's going to lead us in this conversation, and we're really looking forward to it. Amongst other things, Garry will be highlighting the origins of the statement and what it asks of Australian citizens. And for myself, I'm really looking forward to deepening my understanding of what the statement says about sovereignty and treaty. So without further ado, as we all are looking forward to the conversation with Garry, I now ask Lofa to please open with a prayer and acknowledgement of land, and then we pass over to Garry to lead our discussion. Thank you, Lofa.
Let us acknowledge the sovereign and unceded lands and waters of the Puripai people. We pay our respects to elders past and present, and we recognize the work of younger Indigenous leaders in the communities. I also want to pay my respects to those who have joined us today. And I'd like to extend the invitation to those of you who are joining us to please place the original name for the country and land where you are located. Let us come into our opening prayer for today. God of love and hope, we are gathered online this afternoon to be in conversation and to listen to truth-telling. May our hearts be open, may our ears listen to be changed, and may it move us into actions. Thank you for your gifts on Garry and Katalina and others who have gone before us. May we listen today with our hearts and ears so that we are able to move into action. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Lofa. Thank you, Katalina. It's good to be with you again today. I'm going to do something unprecedented. I'm going to share my screen, put a few slides up there for people to see.
Great.
So hopefully this will assist you to work our way through what's happening as I talk.
Thank you, Garry.
So I want to say a little bit first about what the statement is, the Uluru Statement from the Heart. It's a one-page summary, basically, of the conclusions of the First Nations National Constitutional Convention that happened, concluded on May 26, 2017. It was held on Ananu country at Uluru, and that's what's called the Uluru Statement. Interestingly, it's not a document which addresses politicians. It's a document that is addressed to the people who occupy this continent, the Australian people as a whole. I think that's very important. So this is being addressed to all of us who live in these lands. It asserts the sovereignty of First Nations people over Australian lands and waterways, and we'll talk a little bit more about what that means in a moment. It seeks the amendment of the Constitution of Australia, of course, which came to being at Federation, to bring into being an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice to Parliament, first of all. It also proposes what it calls a Makarrata Commission, which would facilitate the negotiation of a treaty, or probably more likely treaties, between First Peoples and Australian governments. And it also proposes that truth-telling about the history of this country be the foundation on which such treaties are negotiated. So that's my summary. Let's get into it in a bit more detail. That is the statement there, with all the signatures of folk who were at the Constitutional Convention, all 250 of them around the outside there. So you need to know that the statement actually emerged through the work of what is known as the Referendum Council. The Constitutional Convention that happened at Uluru was kind of like at the end of a process which was put into place by this Referendum Council. The Referendum Council was appointed jointly by both major parties, Malcolm Turnbull and Bill Shorten, if you remember them, back in 2015. And it was tasked with gauging First Peoples' views about constitutional reform and bringing proposals for a referendum to Parliament. Now, this is crucial, okay? This next bit is really important to help us understand what's going on. A key term of reference, which came out of this bipartisan project, was that any proposals that are brought by the Referendum Council or the Constitutional Convention at the end of that should be realistic and doable within the current political climate. Realistic and doable. So we're not talking here about what Indigenous people might want ultimately. We're talking here about what is realistic and doable in the current political climate, and therefore there is a sense in which this statement is necessarily conservative, politically quite conservative, because it has to get through a referendum process and it has to get the support of the Australian people as a whole. So the council, the Referendum Council, conducted 12 regional constitutions across the nation. So it travelled around from state to state, area to area, and lots and lots of Indigenous organisations and Indigenous leaders were invited to those consultations and thrashed out what they would like to say and what the terms of reference for the Constitutional Convention at the end of this all would be. And those organisations that went to the consultations elected or chose their own representatives to go to the Constitutional Convention, out of which the Uluru Statement came. So the statement from the heart, that summary document, that one-page document that most people now know, summarises the final report of the Referendum Council, which was presented to the Federal Parliament in June of 2017. So there's a nice pic of all the folk at the Constitutional Convention. There were three key people who drove the process, and it's important to know who these people are and where they're coming from, okay? So the first of these was Professor Megan Davis. Megan's a cobble woman from Queensland ultimately, but she actually works in the University of New South Wales as a constitutional lawyer. She's also on some of the peak UN bodies on constitution and Indigenous rights. So she's a very experienced academic in this area, And Megan was actually the one who drafted most of the documents that we have. And then other people worked on them, but she ultimately was the person who put the documents together. Professor Pat Anderson, Alawak from the the Northern Territory, has been working in Indigenous health and wellbeing for a long, long time, and is a senior leader in that sector, who has a lot of respect. She was deeply involved in the drafting process as well, and also has been a key advocate for the Uluru Statement since it has been out there in the public realm.
Mm-hmm.
Noel Pearson from up the Cape Way. A lot of people know Noel because he's been very active for a long, long time. You would also, if you followed Noel's career, he's been the kind of person who's advocated for what you might want to call a realpolitik kind of approach to Indigenous progress. So he's not one to propose things that he thinks will not be acceptable to the Australian public as a whole. So he's been the really strong voice for let's make this doable and realistic in terms of our political climate. That's just where he's come from for a long, long time. And it's also reflected, I think, in the statement. For those who are interested, they were the other members of the Referendum Council. So quite a few Indigenous people there, but you'll notice a number of non-Indigenous people as well, from both sides of the political spectrum, if you like. And obviously some people with a little bit of legal know-how as well in there. So what I want to do now is just do a little bit of exegesis on the text of the Uluru Statement, just noting a few things, and I'll be going through these at a screaming pace in order to allow time for plenty of questions and interrogations at the end. But I just want to point out a few things as we go through kind of paragraph by paragraph. So the opening paragraph says that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander tribes are the sovereign nations of the Australian continent and its adjacent islands, and that we possessed it, in a sense, under our own law. And therefore, because we've been on this continent for at least 60,000 years, I mean, that figure 60,000 in the document is minimal, right? The minimal amount of time we've been here, according to science. But of course, in our dreaming stories, we say from creation. We're not terribly interested in how many years. We just say from creation, we have been here, and the lawyers call it time immemorial. So these are all different ways of referring to the fact that we've been here for a very, very long time. And by virtue of that, we have sovereignty over this continent. So that's the first statement. What kind of sovereignty is it, is then the question that arises. Well, paragraph 2 says this: this sovereignty is a spiritual notion. The ancestral tie between the land, or Mother Nature, and the Australian and Torres Strait Islander peoples who were born therefrom remain attached thereto and must one day return thither to be united with our ancestors. This link is the basis of the ownership of the soil, or better, of sovereignty. It has never been ceded or extinguished and coexists with the sovereignty of the Crown. Now, in earlier versions of the Uluru Statement, the words that you see in italics there were not in italics, but in more recent versions, they put them in italics to indicate that this is actually a quote. This is actually a quote from another document, and that other document is the Mabo decision from 1992 from the High Court of Australia. Now, what you may not know, and I'm finding that many people I talk to don't know this, is that that Mabo decision quote is itself a quote from another judgment that actually dates back to 1975, from a judgment written by a Lebanese Maronite Justice of the International Court of Justice, Dr. Faoud Amoun, concerning land rights in the Western Sahara in 1975. Okay. And in that judgment, if you read it, and I have recently, for the first time, gone into it in detail, what you find there is that Justice Amun is reflecting on this land rights question in the Western Sahara. And in order to reflect on it, he actually quotes from a number of Franciscan and Dominican missionaries from quite a lot earlier in the history of that continent, as they reflect on analogies between Catholic understandings of the rights of human beings in their environments and their lands, and Indigenous understandings of that land and their relationship to it. And so there's already, way back then in 1975, a lot of theologizing going on about what it means for a people to be spiritually connected to land, to ancestral lands. And so that is what the Mabo decision draws into its own judgment in 1992, and now finds its way into the Uluru Statement from the Heart. So in a sense, this notion of sovereignty as a spiritual notion is about relatedness to country. How can it be otherwise is what it goes on to say. That peoples possessed in a land for 60 millennia, and this sacred link disappears from world history in merely the last 200 years. Of course, this is a nonsense. Mm-hmm. How can that relationship with land and with country that has developed over such a long period of time suddenly disappear just because someone else turns up? It's a ridiculous idea. Mm-hmm. And so the statement is saying that we seek structural and constitutional change to recognise this ancient sovereignty. It's not saying that, more recent sovereignties are irrelevant. It's just saying that they have become the dominant discourse. And what we need to do is we need to reflect on this more ancient form of sovereignty, which has never been extinguished. Mm. It then goes on to talk about what the consequences of colonisation have been. And interestingly, it doesn't go into everything, because that would, of course, be a very, very long discourse, and this is a summary statement. But what it does focus on is the way in which Indigenous people are incarcerated at alarming rates when compared to what's going on globally. It says quite correctly, I think, that we are the most incarcerated people on the planet. Mm-hmm. And of course, a lot of those folk who are incarcerated are juveniles, they're kids. Mm-hmm. Here in Victoria, which in many parts of the country don't regard as a terribly Aboriginal place, but here in Victoria, 62% of those in juvenile justice are Indigenous people. And this is reflected all around the country. So, this is put there in the Uluru Statement as an indicative and symbolic statement about just how bad colonialism has been for us, and particularly for our kids. So we're sovereign, and yet we're powerless to do anything about what the colonists do towards us. So again, we see constitutional reforms, the Constitution being the document which provides the legal foundation for everything that can and cannot happen in this country since British colonisation. We seek constitutional forms to give more power to our people to take our rightful place, that is our sovereign place, in this country. Because unless this happens, according to those who gathered at the Constitutional Convention, our children will continue to languish and will never be able to become the flourishing people that they ought to be. And so it then goes on to talk about this voice. And of course, this is what most people are focusing on at the moment, because that's what's been announced by the federal government that they're going to work towards. So there'll be it talks about a First Nations voice enshrined in the Constitution, which will of course require a referendum because you can't change the Constitution without a referendum. And it also talks about Makarrata. Now, this is a Yolngu word. Yolngu people are those who are across the sort of northern coast of the Northern Territory. A Yolngu word which means a coming together after a struggle. It's very interesting that this document, and indeed the referendum report to Parliament, never ever uses the word reconciliation. There is a view in Indigenous Australia, even in the more conservative parts of Indigenous Australia, which this document in a sense represents, that reconciliation hasn't worked because people haven't understood what reconciliation might mean. And so they're doing away with that language and replacing it with this more Indigenous Yolngu language of Makarrata, coming together after a struggle. It captures our aspirations for a fair and truthful relationship with the people of Australia and a better future for our children. So this is the second time that children have been mentioned in the document. They're wanting to convey that we're doing this and we're proposing this and we're putting this pathway before the Australians for the sake of our children. You know, we want a better future for them, and that's what this is all about. So it also envisages alongside the voice a Makarrata commission. So this would be a commission which is set up by government on the advice of the voice, okay, to supervise a process of agreement making, that is treaty making between First Nations governments and First Nations people, and it would all be based upon a truth-telling process. So the voice comes first, and then treaty and truth is the way that it sets up the progress. And there's a very explicit statement here addressing the Australian people as a whole. In 1967, we were counted. In 2017, we seek to be heard. We leave base camp and we start our trek across this vast country, and we invite you, that is the people of Australia, not just politicians, but the people of Australia as a whole, to walk with us in a movement for a better future for our kids, basically, is what it's saying. So you'll be aware that the first reaction from government, within weeks of the report being promulgated and the treaty, the Uluru Statement being published, was rejection by the Turnbull government. That happened at the Garma Festival in 2017. When the Morrison government came into being, also it was rejected. But it says it also rejecting the statement. It nevertheless set up a design committee to design a voice to Parliament. So the idea here was that the voice would be legislated by Parliament based on whatever this design committee came up with, but there wouldn't be any need to change the Constitution to do that. So this is what the view of the Morrison government and Ken Wyatt as Indigenous Affairs Minister wanted to do. And they appointed, of course, two Indigenous leaders to work on the design of the voice, Marsha Langton, who's a Professor of Indigenous Studies at Melbourne Uni, and Tom Karma on the right, who's a former Indigenous Commissioner in the Human Rights Commission, but also the Chancellor of ANU, to start working on this, this design of the voice. Of course, we now have a new Labor government, and the Labor government has committed to a referendum to embed the voice in the Constitution. And so what has changed is I've just crossed out the words, but not changing the Constitution to do so. and put in to be enshrined in the Constitution. So the same committee with a few additional members is working on what the voice might be and how the voice might be appointed or elected. But this time they're talking about embedding it in the Constitution through a referendum. So the referendum question, as announced at the Garma Festival on July the 30th of this year, is this: do you support an alteration to the Constitution that establishes an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice? So a very simple question that you can answer yes or no. That is the referendum question that is most likely to go to the Australian people sometime next year. When is the referendum likely to happen? Well, the latest information I have, and if someone has, newer, better information than me, I'm happy for you to share it. But the best information that I have is that there are two possible dates: May 27, which of course will follow National Sorry Day and also be the anniversary of the Constitutional Convention, which promulgated the Uluru Statement. And the other possibility is January 27 in 2024. So May 27 next year would be the earlier one, January 27, 2024. My gut feeling is they'll end up going for 2024 because there's a lot of education of the Australian public of what this is all about, I think, yet to happen. And indeed, education of Indigenous communities as well, who I think many of whom are very puzzled about all of this stuff. The other thing that Albanese announced at the Garma Festival was 3 proposed sentences about how the Constitution itself might actually be altered on the basis of that referendum. So they would add 3 sentences into the Constitution. There shall be a body to be called the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice. The Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice makes representations to Parliament and the executive government on matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. The Parliament shall, subject to this Constitution, have power to make laws with respect to the composition, functions, powers, and procedures of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. So how would the Constitution be amended? It would recognise that there would be this kind of representative group of Indigenous people who would be called the voice to Parliament. It's obviously not a third chamber because it has no power to operate to make legislation on its own. It can represent Indigenous views, diverse as they're likely to be, to the Parliament and to executive government on behalf of Indigenous people. But the kicker here, which I want you to notice, and this is the conservative proposal part of this whole deal, right? The Parliament, subject to the Constitution, has power to make laws with respect to the composition, functions, powers, and procedures of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. So how will the voice function? The way that Parliament wants it to function. Okay?
Yeah.
Parliament has power. The voice has no power except to make representations to give advice. There's the really conservative bit, folks. All right. Is it a third chamber of Parliament? I've said already, no, it isn't. The power remains with Parliament. So this is not like, a Welsh Assembly or a Scottish Assembly in the United Kingdom. This is not like the Sami Assembly in Finland, which can make laws itself and enact those laws for a particular people group. No. This is an advisory group. A lot like ATSIC back in the early 90s that was done away by the Howard government with some small differences. So the question I want to ask then is is this: is the proposed voice a priority for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples? Well, I think you have to say yes. You have to say yes, because this comes out of a consultation process which is unprecedented in the history of this colony. You know, Indigenous people, Indigenous organisations were consulted about what they want, and this is what we all came up with, apparently. So you have to say yes, but I would add with some qualifications. The authors of the Uluru Statement obviously argue that the voice needs to come first so that it can propose arrangements for the Makarrata Commission, which will oversee truth-telling and treaty. But there are other Indigenous people, many of them very senior, often academics, and obviously Greens politicians, as we've heard quite vocally in the last 6 months or so, arguing that all three aspects of the statement need to be progressed together. That we can't just work on the voice and then come up with a truth-telling process and a treaty process out of that. That is entirely dependent upon government saying yes to all of those things. In fact, what you see happening in the state of Victoria, the colony of Victoria, is that all three things are happening together right now. And I want to just tell you a little bit about what's happening in Victoria, because it contrasts in some ways with what the pathway of the Uluru Statement has proposed. So in the state of Victoria, we have a treaty process which is already underway. The first step, it was the election of a First Peoples Assembly, representing both traditional owners and Aboriginal residents of the state. Of course, you can't just have traditional owners represented, because colonisation moved us all over the country. So most of us actually live a long, long way from where we come from originally, because of the process of, the frontier wars and then stolen generations and missions and all of that sort of stuff. So because of all of that, it's important that people who are not traditional owners where they live also have a voice. And so this First Peoples Assembly was set up to represent both bodies, traditional owners, but also other Indigenous people resident within the state. So that actually happened. I voted in those elections back in 2019, and the people on the screen were the people who were elected. So that body already exists and is working. The second part of this process in Victoria is that a number of people were appointed as commissioners to what is called the Yurruk Justice Commission. So you'll know some of these people, Professor Eleanor Burke, Uncle Wayne Atkins. We've also got Sue Hunter here, Wurundjeri woman. We've got my kinsperson, Maggie Walter, Professor Maggie Walter. And we've also got the Honorary Kevin Bell, who's a non-Indigenous man, a QC. So the Yurruk Justice Commission has been tasked with the truth-telling part of the equation. So they've been going around Victoria talking to Indigenous groups, Indigenous elders, particularly the very old with long memories, to talk about their experiences of colonisation, so that it can be read into a very big report about the history of what has actually happened to people, to Indigenous people in this part of the world. Step 3 in the treaty process here is that legislation was passed on June the 10th, so very recently, for an independent treaty authority. Now, the task of the treaty authority is to be a kind of independent umpire when we get to the point of negotiating treaties between traditional owners and also representative Indigenous groups and the state government. Interestingly, the state government is very happy for all of those people to be Indigenous people. So the independent umpire in the treaty negotiations is going to be Indigenous people. Very interesting. 5 Indigenous people, not these people on the screen. These are all members of the First Peoples Assembly, but they will be appointed senior Indigenous leaders. The other thing that's part of this whole process is what is being called an elder's voice to the Assembly of Victorian First Peoples. So the Assembly's role is to put all this stuff together, right? And it's very, very important that elders' voices don't get lost in all of this, which can sometimes happen because younger people are a bit more verbose, you know. So an elder's voice to the Assembly of Victorian First Peoples who are putting this whole thing together is being put in place. And that's being overseen by Auntie Shemaine and Uncle Andrew here on the screen. The last step is actually to put in place a treaty negotiation framework. In other words, what are the rules? If you're going to have treaty talks between government, whether it be local government or state government, and Indigenous people, Indigenous organisations, what are the rules that we all agree on for those negotiations? You can't negotiate unless you've got some common ground rules, right? So there is a treaty negotiation framework, which is, again, being put in place as we speak, and that is pending. So in summary, what's happening in Victoria is via legislation alone, there is a process underway, and it's already been running for a couple of years already, to put in place a voice, the voice being the First Peoples Assembly, to put in place a truth-telling commission, which is the Uruk Commission, and also a treaty framework so that treaties can actually start to be negotiated. And all of this is likely to be put in place and ready to go by about this time next year. So all three are happening at once via legislation. Now, the disadvantage of doing it all by legislation is that if there's a change of government in Victoria, this could all go away overnight, literally overnight, because you know, the other major party has said we don't want to have a bar of any of this stuff. So that is the disadvantage of doing this via legislation. You've got to have a friendly government who's willing to, in a sense, step back from its own natural power under colonial legislation and allow Indigenous people to take control of this process, which is what is happening here in Victoria. The advantage is you can get a lot done. You can work on all three things at once. The disadvantage is it could all go away overnight if you get a change of government. Now, the Uluru process, as it's been proposed, tries to make it more difficult for governments to ignore Indigenous people by enshrining a voice to government, which would be proposing a process of truth-telling and treaty making in the Constitution, so that it's really difficult for governments to simply ignore that voice. The disadvantage, it seems to me, of the Uluru process as it's been proposed is that even if you get a voice, even if the referendum succeeds and you get a voice and everyone agrees on what it should look like and how people should be elected or appointed to that body, government, if it's unfriendly, can simply ignore everything that that voice says. It might be enshrined in the Constitution, but what is enshrined in the Constitution is that this body has no power. It only has the power of advice. And therefore, if you've got an unfriendly government, it may have to hear what Indigenous people are saying in the voice, but it doesn't have to do a damn thing about what that voice says. Just a few links there for anyone who's interested in following this stuff up when it comes to the referendum council's process, the Uluru Statement, but also the stuff that's happening in Victoria as a way of doing a little bit of compare and contrast. Now, so let's see what people have got to say and what sort of questions they might want to ask about it.
Oh, thank you so much, Garry. I mean, if other people who are listening and being part of this have my experience, I feel really, really grateful, because I understand much better the whole statement and what it's about. Now, do we have any questions coming through already?
There's one there from Andrew Watts first up, I think. Yeah, which as he's just said now, I just answered. So I read your mind, Andrew. I don't know how I did that, but I read your mind. I guess I've given this seminar a few times in different places, and that's one of the questions that comes up pretty early on. Yes, in Victoria, this is all legislated, and so therefore it is vulnerable if there's a change of government. The whole thing would have to go on hold, for probably a long time. That doesn't mean that the people who are very, very committed to this wouldn't continue to work on it in various ways, as it were, off the payroll. But the advantage, of course, of doing this stuff with the assistance of government is there's a funding base, and you can employ people to work on this stuff, which is what's happened in Victoria, and that's really, really good. Yeah, but it could go away overnight, obviously. Yeah,
it's amazing what's happening in Victoria, but as you say, Garry, it's not. It could change any time if an unfriendly government comes into power. But with the change to the constitution, is there no room anymore to continue to push the Albanese government to change the constitution in such a way that gives the voice power, instead of just having this advisory status that and therefore subject to the government changing whatever it wants to change and doing whatever it wants? Is there any room to do that, or is it too late?
Yeah. But in the in the vision of those who promulgated the Uluru Statement, it would be the voice that would be the primary advocate for a treaty process, what that would look like, how it would be structured, and also a truth-telling commission. Okay, so the idea is you get the voice in place, you get it constitutionally enshrined, and then the voice can be a strong advocate to government about how you go about doing that. It can set up its own, what are they called?
Process and
statutory authorities, with the agreement of government, obviously, to sort of work on those things and bring forward proposals and so forth. So it would suddenly become the sort of go-to group for government to work with, if the government is friendly.
Exactly.
If the government is friendly. So this is the point that more progressive Indigenous academics and also some of the Greens politicians have been saying. If you've got a friendly government, yes, the voice can be great. But if you've got an unfriendly government, then they can just ignore you. And that's
so it's really no different from where the state government in Victoria, and that whole process of the treaty. They're both at the whim of government and the changing in government and where that particular government is at, right?
Yeah.
There's no point to the
it doesn't matter, in a sense, it doesn't matter which way you go. The power is in the hands of the colonial authorities. It is still, because we're on this side of actual treaty negotiations rather than the other side of treaty negotiations, because we're on this side, that means that the colonial status quo is still in place, regardless of whether you have a voice or whether you have a legislated process like what's happening in Victoria, because in the end, the colonial authorities, whether it be federal parliament or a state parliament, can simply just rule out whatever is proposed. So that is the difficulty. That is the difficulty with both these proposals.
Yeah.
It's only when you get to the other side of a treaty process. In other words, if you can get the community, in the case of, a referendum to Parliament, or the Parliament itself thereafter, whether it be in a local state area or whether it be federally, if you can get them on side long enough to get through a treaty process that comes out with some more just settlement as part of that at the other end, that's when things might change, when a genuine change in the balance of power might occur. But while we're on this side of a treaty process, however you get there, the colonial powers will remain, in the status quo position that we have now. That is just the fact of the situation.
Because if we, I can see a couple of questions, but it seems to me you're answering it as you're talking. But I'm thinking that to get to the point of having, a similar structure as in Finland and, with the Sami parliament, I think it's the same in Norway, that there's a Sami parliament with that kind of status, or the Welsh parliament. To get to that point, we've got to be able to allow a treaty process to take place, in its complete and full sense of the process. But in that process, a new government could come along and just turn it upside down, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So
So in other words, Indigenous people remain incredibly fragile, vulnerable in this whole process, regardless of whether you go the Uluru Statement for the Heart direction or whether you go the Victorian direction. We remain very vulnerable until you actually have some agreements in process as a result of treaty talks. Which are then legislated, embedded in the Constitution, in a more complete and full way. So we're a long, 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 long way from that. We're the only sort of former British colony in the world that doesn't have some kind of treaty in place. Now the Canadians and the Native Americans and the
Kiwis,
Aotearoa and New Zealand people will tell you they're crap treaties, right?
But they still have
at least they're treaties and therefore have to be dealt with in one way or another. We don't have anything like that here, and we're not going to change the balance of power until we have a treaty. So, hopefully we can have governments in place either way we go, which will be friendly enough to the process of actually doing that until we get to the other side of that hill, as it were. Up the hill, treaties, down the hill to some kind of just settlement that's embedded in the Constitution and in the legislation both. But until that happens, we're still very, very vulnerable.
So really, as we've got the Albanese government that is showing, more, support or maybe some room for the treaty to get going, the process to happen, and we go over the hill. So we're hoping that the Albanese government will be in place for that length of time, right? Because it seems to me blatantly obvious that the other party will definitely, going by Morrison and what's his name before him?
I don't know. Someone or other.
The one before him. I'm sorry, I just can't. I'm blank. Anyway, going by that, it seems to be quite clear that another government of that hue will be very unsupportive. Will just completely dismiss the whole thing, immediately. Is that correct, Garry?
Well, I'm not sure. It seems to me that the Uluru Statement, because it came out of a process that was a bipartisan agreement, was designed to be sort of conservative enough to actually
doable,
try and gain the support of bipartisan support. And the one small difference, of course, is that one wanted to do it by legislation, that is the Liberal government, and the Labor government wants to do it by referendum and a constitutional amendment. So they were both wanting to design a voice. The Morrison government and the Albanese government, they were both wanting to design a voice, but one wanted to do it via legislation, another one wanted to embed it in the Constitution as the Uluru people wanted it. Either way, you design a voice, but the problem is that then governments have to decide that they're going to go with the advice of that voice, and they can say, no, we're not going to go with that voice,
absolutely.
or we like that bit, but we're going to put that bit aside, that sort of thing. So that's the fundamental criticism that's being brought by a number of Indigenous academics and obviously the Green senators. But the Victorian map, which depends upon a friendly government and is doing it all by legislation and doing it fairly quickly.
Yes, exactly.
Because a lot of power by legislation has now been put in the hands of Indigenous people, the People's Assembly, the Uruk Justice Commission, the umpire for treaty negotiations, the treaty negotiations framework. A lot of power has been put in the hands of Indigenous people, but change of government, all of that could come back. And in Victoria, someone's asked about, are we talking about sort of statewide treaties, national treaties, local treaties? In Victoria, we're talking about all three. It's pretty clear to most Indigenous people, I think, that we need a national treaty. Yes. Which in a sense deals with the constitutional powers of the federal government. But we also, obviously, there are state governments have their own powers. And so in those realms, we need to have an agreement with Indigenous people as well. And also in Australia, because we have local government, there will have to be agreements between local government and local Aboriginal controlled organisations. So there might be similarities through there, but they'll also be dealing with different parts of the powers of these different governments, because that is the colonial status quo.
Yes. Gary, there is a question from Stephen Ames asking about Aboriginal, like sovereignty as a word in Aboriginal languages. He's saying, is sovereignty a word in Aboriginal languages?
Yeah. Well, the answer is no, of course, Stephen, because sovereignty is a European word. And
what's the equivalent?
It's basically a word that's associated with the law of property as it comes to us from Northern Europe through common law and also through legislation, but principally in common law. So what Indigenous people would say about sovereignty is, we're happy to use that word because you guys seem to know what it's about, but we want to queer it a bit, we want to tweak it a bit, we want to mess with it a bit, so that it can begin to reflect something of what we understand by relationship with country. And what we understand, by relationship with country is that we have a responsibility to care for country. So it's not actually a sort of Western rights-based approach. It's an Indigenous responsibility-based approach. We have our ownership means we have a responsibility to care for country in such a way that country will be able to continue to sustain us and all life, in fact, not just human beings, but all life, for a jolly long time to come, So a lot of the stuff we're doing to the environment now would be anathema to an Indigenous understanding of sovereignty, because for us it is primarily about caring for country so that country can care for us, and that we can all sustain life in a sort of mutually coherent matrix of care and reciprocity into the future for a long time to come, rather than the balance of power at the moment being in the favour of human beings who want to rape and exploit country in order to make a lot of money. So that is the difference. But obviously, because we're talking to European-based legal systems, we need to talk about sovereignty. So we're just trying to tweak it in our direction, Stephen. That's it.
Yeah, and that's why I guess, Gary, you were emphasizing when you explained earlier that the kind of sovereignty is a spiritual understanding of relationship between land and people, which is very, very different from a more Western capitalistic, commercial understanding of sovereignty.
Yes, exactly.
That's
I know a number of people are asking the question, well, how do I vote? Okay, we're going to have a referendum. It might be in May next year, but more likely to be early in 2024. How do I vote? I'm saying to people, any vote which gives Indigenous people a slightly higher profile and a better voice is worth saying yes to. You know, you might have all sorts of unresolved questions about whether the balance of power will ever change, and those are legitimate questions to ask. But if you're given an opportunity, any opportunity in any way, to say yes, we want Indigenous voices to be listened to in this country, my strong advice and actually I beg you, say yes. You know, we still have a long way to go, but unless we can say yes at a national level to even something as simple as, do Indigenous people have a right to say stuff, we should say yes. And really at the heart of the referendum question is that, you know, should Indigenous people be able to say stuff to government? I think the answer has to be yes. Now, you might want to have, there might be a lot of other stuff that follows on from that, which is incredibly complicated, about the ongoing balance of power issues that we won't resolve until we actually have some treaty talks and put in place a different settlement, a different constitutional settlement. But this initial question is just a very simple one. Do you think that Indigenous people should be able to have a say to government? I beg you to say yes.
The referendum question.
It's the very least, you know.
It's true. And like you say, the more power that is, you know, political power that is given to the voice, the better. In the same way that, you know, it's happening in Victoria with the state government and, you know, the treaty that is going on there. Like you said, you know, everything is happening pretty quickly because a lot of power has been given to Aboriginal folks to do what needs to be done.
So legislation, if you've got a friendly government, legislation can get it done quickly. You can just say, here, Indigenous people, here's a whole bunch of power. Do what you want to do with it, which is what's happened here in Victoria, you know. But it's very vulnerable at the same time because a change of government can knock it all over, you know. So
I mean, I'm seeing a question from Luisa Foliaki, and she's saying, she's wondering if it is naive, you know, to say maybe for the time being, because, you know, it must have taken you know, some pushing just to even get the voice to be established, you know, to be accepted as something to, you know, that can be used as an instrument, at least get something going for the time being, while we, you know, well, I don't know, we continue to find a better way to recognize Aboriginal voices in the process.
I mean, my stance is I can't do a damn thing about what Indigenous people think and do and vote and whatever. I can't do anything about that. And it would be naive of me to think that non-Indigenous people as a whole are going to give up power, or at least a large chunk of it. You know, I think that would be naive. So all I can do on my side of the ledger is work damn hard from the Indigenous point of view to sort of progress things as much as we can. But, you know, as Chelsea Watego says, I think quite rightly, Indigenous people can't act on the basis of a hope that non-Indigenous people will always come to the party, because there's actually no evidence for that if you look backwards. So all we can do is we can keep working and keep doing our own stuff, standing on our own sovereignty, as it were. And assuming that we are sovereign, because actually we are, and keep operating out of that. We can't do a thing really about what non-Indigenous people decide or not decide to do. All we can do is keep saying, this is how we see it, this is our experience, and just hope, you know, I guess that people will come to the party eventually.
I mean, and what strikes me, Garry, as well, is, you know, you emphasize at the beginning that the whole approach was about doing what's realistic and doable, you know, and maybe, you know, the reason that that Aboriginal people have ended up with this, and the whole of us in Australia ending up with this, you know, a voice that is really just advisory and has no power. Maybe that's, you know, the compromising had to happen to even get that through, you know. Do you think Noel Pearson?
This, I mean, this is progress.
It's not much, but
it's, well, I'll take anything we can get. You know?
Yeah.
I mean, Scott's pointed out that the Sahara decision that came through into the Mabo decision and then into the Uluru Statement of the Heart.
Yeah.
Because there's a theological conversation going on in those decisions. Maybe this is something we can talk in the churches about. You know? So I think Scott, absolutely. There's a space there for conversation, and I know that there's a few papers coming out in books in the next little while that sort of draws on that tradition and offers something to the Australian churches. I guess, you know, as a guy who's more of a preacher than an academic, it has to be said, there's a sense in which the preacher can only persuade. You know, the preacher has no power, really, in any sort of legislative or constitutional sense to make anyone do a damn thing. But it seems to me that preachers and theologians, in a sense, all we can do is bear witness to things and hope that the hearers will make their own decisions for good and right and justice, you know.
Yeah.
But we can certainly have those conversations, hoping that people who are listening in will learn some things and take it into fora that make a difference. Yeah. Whether it be the boardroom or the university or the parliament
or the congregation. Folks, it's been really fantastic, but I've been warned that we're running out of, that we've gone over time. Thank you so much for those who have been, you know, participating and sending in their questions. Please go away continuing to reflect on this. I'm just going to go around the panelists now to just ask for quick final statements. I'll ask Lofa first, and then I'll go to Garry. And then, you know, I'll do a very brief announcement, and then we'll have to close with our closing prayer. But Lofa, did you want to say one final quick comment?
Yeah, thanks, Lina, and thank you, Garry, for all the critical thinking around the statement. And I think for me, it's you've offered so much of that, and I'll continue to reflect on some of those points. It's very heavy, but I think it's important that we sit and reflect on it in the next few weeks and months. So thank you, Garry. Absolute gift. Thank you.
Garry, did you have something further to add, please?
Yeah. Thanks, Lofa. Look, you know, the Referendum Council's report is the kind of thing that anyone who's used to having to write an essay for uni or something can read in an afternoon or a morning, you know. And it's actually it's not complicated at all. It's worth having a bit of a read. And likewise, the stuff that's on the Victorian First Peoples Assembly website is all laid out in really, really simple, you know, frequently asked questions kind of ways. So, you know, I think that if you can read and if you can have a look at some of this stuff, you'll find that it's actually pretty easy to process. And maybe it can become discussion starters for little groups and Bible study groups and you know, that kind of thing. You know, I think absolutely I'd encourage people to do that.
Yeah. Thank you, Garry. It's been absolutely informative, and like, you know, we've already got some feedback saying this has been absolutely helpful. Thank you, Garry, for doing this. So, you know, if you want to do it again, so to get more people who might want to have that similar you know, kind of a workshop presentation, Garry, we will do it again on this webinar because it's absolutely
well, maybe we could get someone who really knows what they're talking about, like Nathan Tyson on, you know, someone like that.
We've got Auntie Ann Patel Gray, the Professor Ann Patel Gray, next month, so we'll continue to talk about it. I think, you know, and the other thing that I want to say as my last comment is, it seems to me if I have this image in my brain as you're talking in my mind, that if every state in Australia was to do similar things to what's happening in Victoria, that, that would be fantastic as a way to even make sure that the federal government, is pressured to do what needs to be done at that level. But if every state was able to do a similar thing, so maybe this is for us church people. We can have Bible studies about it. We can talk about it in our congregations and in our elders groups as a way of, trying to, raise awareness and push the agenda out there, to think about how we can politicize that consciousness, the theological, conversations, and maybe start that kind of thing happening in our different states. I don't know, I'm just thinking if that can happen,
There's stuff happening in South Australia and Tasmania.
There you go.
So there's some good good green shoots. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, fantastic. Thank you so much. It's this is what
just
happens.
for those who have asked about the recording.
Yeah.
What's going to happen after this is we'll send this through to the UD and they'll upload it to the UD's YouTube channel.
Yes.
So if you look there in a week or so, hopefully it'll be there.
Yeah. Thank you, Gary. So everybody, this should be available on YouTube in about 2 weeks' time. Is that right, Gary? Yeah.
Yep. I reckon by 2 weeks we'll be fine.
Okay.
Yep.
Well, our next webinar, of course, next month. I already said it's Professor Anne Battelle-Gray that will be joining us for that one. So looking forward to all of you joining again. It'll be daylight saving, so I just need to remind everybody. So watch out for the promo material that'll have, new sort of timing, or at least the time difference will be longer. And I'm very conscious of that being, from WA. But, Gary, so thankful. Very, good to see you again. And we look forward to seeing you again in the future. Thank you, Lofa. And thank you, Liliani. And thank you, everybody who joined in. We hope to see you again on our Black Lives, Matter webinar in the future. I'm going to pray now. So let us pray. Loving God, we are so thankful always for the opportunities that you present us with, to have conversations and to share ideas and to share stories and to find ways in which we can be authentic disciples in working for justice in this world. Thank you so much for the very informative and extensive explanation that helps us tonight from Gary. It helped us to understand the statement, the Uluru Statement from the heart, and all the complexities around the political scene in Aboriginal folks working hard to bring recognition, to bring treaty, to bring reconciliation that is so long overdue. Lord, help us and help this country to realize the potential that you meant for it. And we can only realize that potential if we do what needs to be done and ensure justice for Aboriginal people is achieved. Thank you for this moment. And we go from this place with a lot to think about, and help us in our reflection, that we come to some places where we can take all that we've heard and learned into action, and action that will make a difference. In your name we pray. Amen. Thanks again, Gary.
Thank you.
That was great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Lovely to see you again.
You too.
Bye for now.
Yeah. Bye for now. We'll see you soon. Bye, Lofa. Bye, Gary. Bye, Liliani, all the way in Norway.